Somewhere in these mountains, in a kitchen drawer or a cigar box on a closet shelf, there is a pocket knife with almost no blade left. What remains of it curves inward like a thin crescent. The point is gone, and the back of the blade now stands taller than the cutting edge, because the edge has been carried away by hand, a little at a time, across 60 or 70 years of sharpening. A dealer would call that knife used up. A collector would set it down and reach for something else. It may be the most honest object in the house. This is the story of 15 knives that working families in the Appalachian mountains carried on their bodies, day after day, in an economy that ran short of nearly everything except work. They almost certainly did not call them poor man's knives. That phrase is ours, and it is only fair to say so out loud before going any further. What the mountains actually had was harder to name, a habit of pulling the greatest possible usefulness out of the smallest possible amount of cash. Hold on to one idea, because everything else in this story hangs from it. The more useful a knife was, the less of it survived. A knife in mint condition tells you what a factory made. A knife worn down to a sliver tells you what a family needed. Two questions will stay open for a while. Why did one of the plainest pocket knives ever manufactured become the knife a working boy was most likely to own? And why does one ordinary Appalachian knife name still get misread by collectors, almost every single time? Both answers come later. Start with the harder question. What did a family carry when buying another knife was simply not an option? In 1966, a young English teacher named Elliot Wigginton took a job at the Rabun Gap Nacoochee School in the Georgia mountains and handed his students an unusual assignment. Go home. Ask the oldest people you know how things were actually done. Write it down before it disappears. What those students brought back became Foxfire. And in the fourth volume, sitting between wood carving and fiddle making, there is a chapter with a title that says more about mountain economics than any statistic could. Knife making, not knife buying. Because in a county short of cash, the first place a man looked for steel was not a store shelf. It was the scrap pile behind the barn. The material he wanted most was a worn-out mill file. A file that no longer bites is worthless to almost everyone. It is dull, it is rusted, and it will never do its old job again. But it is also hard steel that somebody else already paid for, and in a place where $1 was hard to come by and a hard afternoon was not, that arithmetic was not close. Nothing was scrap while it still had another job left in it. Understand what that sentence means in practice, because it is the engine underneath this entire list. A tool did not retire in these mountains. It got demoted. The plow point became a wedge. The wedge became a hinge. And the file that could no longer sharpen a saw became the knife a man carried until the day he died. The second source of steel came from an industry that was busy tearing the mountains apart. Between the 1880s and the 1930s, industrial logging moved through southern Appalachia at a speed the region had never seen. Company towns went up around sawmills in East Tennessee, western North Carolina, and West Virginia, and sawmills break blades. A shattered circular saw, or a snapped bandsaw, was a loss on the company's books. To a man who worked in that mill, it was a sheet of good steel lying on the ground. Knives made from saw plate turn up again and again in mountain collections. Thin, wide, flat ground, often with a homemade sheath cut from harness leather. The record here is thinner than the record for anything else on this list, and that should be said plainly. What survives is mostly objects, not documents. But the objects are consistent enough to make the point. In the mountains, steel did not arrive first as a product. It arrived as a byproduct. The third knife in this story did not start out as a knife anyone would carry. In 1889, 3 men in Naples, New York, William Ensworth, Charles Brace, and William Maudsley, began grinding blades on a water-powered stone and selling them off pushcarts through the surrounding countryside. The company took its name from the county, Ontario. Decades later, in 1924, under a president named James Christensen, Ontario introduced a line of kitchen cutlery with hardwood handles, brass rivets, and plain high-carbon steel. They called it Old Hickory. It was cheap, it was tough, and it sharpened easily. And it went into kitchens, butcher shops, and restaurants across the country, and stayed there for generations. Here is the part the catalogs never covered. A carbon steel butcher knife, sharpened every week for 20 years, does not stay a butcher knife. It narrows. It loses width until it is too slender to rock through a shoulder of pork. At which point, in a household with money, it goes in the trash. In a household without money, it gets a new edge ground onto it, a new handle if it needs one, a sheath sewn from a boot top, and it goes onto a belt. Some of the mountain belt knives sitting in museum cases today did not begin life as belt knives. John Rice Irwin, the educator and historian who founded the Museum of Appalachia at Norris, Tennessee, built an entire institution around exactly this kind of object, the everyday thing nobody thought worth saving. This is one of the places where the object is the evidence, and the paperwork is silent, so label it honestly, strongly supported by the artifacts, thinly documented on the page. And notice what is already happening. That strange narrow profile, the one that looks like a design choice, is not a design choice at all. It is a biography. Now a problem almost nobody plans for. Sometimes the handle dies before the blade does. Bone cracks. Wood splits along the grain. Celluloid, which the industry loved because it was cheap and colorful, shrinks and warps, and eventually eats the metal it is riveted to. So the blade is perfectly good, the springs still snap, and the knife is unusable. A man with money buys another knife. A man without money cuts 2 new scales, hickory, cow horn, a slab of deer antler, and by the middle of the century, whatever hard plastic happened to be lying around, and pins them on. In the language of the modern market, that is called damage. A replaced handle is the first thing a listing apologizes for. Think about what that means. The market penalizes the exact act that kept the object alive. A repaired knife is not a broken knife. It is a knife somebody refused to give up on. Which brings us to the cheapest knife in Appalachia, and it is not a pattern at all. The cheapest knife in these mountains was the one somebody else had already paid for. An inherited pocket knife arrives with things a new knife cannot have. It arrives with another man's sharpening angle already ground into the edge. It arrives with one side of the bolster polished brighter than the other, because it rode in the same pocket, against the same seam, for 30 years. Sometimes it arrives with the blade already half gone, meaning the person who receives it inherits not just a tool, but the remaining balance of somebody else's working life. The oral histories are full of these handovers. What those histories almost never record is the date, the price, or the pattern, which is exactly why this part of the story is so easy to romanticize and so hard to cite. So take only what the evidence gives. In a cash-poor economy, the most common way to acquire a knife was not to buy one. And then something arrived in the mountains that made all of this look, for a moment, like the past. A working man's pocket knife got cheap. Genuinely, shockingly cheap. And the pattern that came to stand for that whole shift was one of the plainest folding knives ever put into mass production, the Barlow. In 1876, Mark Twain gave it a price. In The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Tom is handed a brand new Barlow, and Twain puts its worth at 12.5 cents, then describes a boy so overwhelmed by it that the gift shakes him to his foundations. 2 honest notes before that number does any work. Twain was writing fiction, and he was writing about Missouri, not Appalachia. This is a period valuation of a pattern, not a receipt from a store in Harlan County. But it tells you the tier the knife lived in. 12.5 cents was 1 bit, a coin a boy could plausibly be given. The design is a study in deliberate cheapness that somehow refused to become junk. The bolster runs unusually long down the handle, which means less handle material and more reinforcement, exactly where inexpensive knives fail. At the pivot, the steel is plain carbon. The bone is barely polished. Everything that could be left off was left off. Everything that kept it working stayed. Now the part where careful people should slow down. The Barlow's origin story is told with enormous confidence and very little agreement. The English tradition points to a Sheffield workshop and a man named Obadiah Barlow, somewhere around the 1670s. That is tradition, not documentation, and it should be carried lightly. The American side is worse. John Russell's Green River Works is widely credited as the first American maker of the pattern, but the year you will find published ranges from 1785 to 1875 to the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876. 3 different years. All of them printed somewhere with total confidence. Mark Zaleski works this exact territory for a living. He edited Knife magazine from 1997 and eventually bought the publication outright, and his specialty is the gap between what collectors are certain of and what the documents will actually support. So, here is the honest version. The Barlow was cheap, it was everywhere, and its American birthday is unresolved. Open a plain jackknife from this era, and there are usually 2 blades, a long clip blade and a small pen blade beside it. The obvious reading is that 2 blades are a small luxury. The obvious reading is wrong. 2 blades were a strategy for managing steel. The clip blade takes the punishment. It cuts baling twine, feed sacks, tar paper, green wood, leather. It gets dull, and it gets sharpened, and every sharpening takes a little more of it away. The pen blade is protected. It stays keen, because it is only asked to do the work that requires a clean edge, lifting a splinter out of a palm, trimming a hoof paring, shaping a peg, cutting a stitch. So what does that actually buy a family? Time. A man with 1 blade sharpens constantly and watches his only knife shrink. A man with 2 blades can afford to let one of them go dull. Add a 3rd blade, and the knife acquires a job description. The stockman. 3 blades, the clip, a blunt-nosed sheepfoot, and a spay. This was the knife of the small livestock economy. A milk cow, a few hogs, a mule, chickens, and a barn that needed something cut roughly 40 times a day. The sheepfoot has no point at all. That looks like a defect until you have tried to cut a rope near a nervous animal in a dark barn at 5 in the morning. A point catches. A point punctures the thing you are trying to free. A blunt nose does the work, and nothing else, and that is the whole design. Then there is the spay blade, and here is a detail most people carrying a stockman today have never been told. The spay blade is named for a specific livestock procedure. Spaying, the castration of farm animals, was ordinary, routine, seasonal work on any place that raised stock, and cutlery firms built a dedicated blade for it and put it in a man's pocket, which is worth pausing on. A tool that is now bought for nostalgia was designed around a chore. The next pattern is the one where this list has to admit a weakness. The pruner is a folding knife with a hooked blade, a hawkbill, and it works by pulling rather than pushing. The curve grabs the stem and draws itself into the cut, which means less force, less slipping, and less damage to the plant. Appalachia had a real fruit economy. Apple orchards across western North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia were cash-producing operations in a region that had very little cash. But here is the honest limit, and it belongs in the open. The hawkbill's job is well documented. Its presence in the pocket of an Appalachian orchard family every day, rather than every October, is not documented nearly as well. What can be said is narrower and still worth saying. Where a crop paid in cash, the tool that served that crop tended to stay on the person who tended it. Treat that one as a strong probability rather than a settled fact. This channel would rather come up short than fill a slot with something it cannot defend. Now stop the list, because the most important thing in this story is not a knife. It is the arrival of the mail. For most of the 19th century, a mountain family bought hardware in one of 3 ways: from a local blacksmith, from a general store that stocked whatever a drummer had hauled up the valley, or from a neighbor, in trade. Then 2 things changed at once. The railroads reached into the coves after the Civil War, and in 1894, Congress passed the Rural Free Delivery Act. Before that law, rural Americans traveled to a post office to collect their own mail or paid a carrier to bring it. After it, the mail came to them, at no charge. At the time, roughly 65% of the country lived in the countryside. Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck had put out their first catalog in 1891. It ran 322 pages. By 1902, the book itself was not free. The cloth-bound edition cost $1, the paperback 50 cents. In a year, when 40 cents bought a pair of the best German knit socks the company sold. Which raises the question this whole video has been walking toward. The blacksmith did not forget how to make a knife. So why did the factory knife win? Not on quality. A good mountainsmith could put an edge on a piece of file steel that would outlast anything stamped out in Rhode Island. It won on three things the forge could not match: price, speed, and credit. A blacksmith has to be paid, and in a cash-poor county, he is often paid in labor, in cornmeal, in a share of a hog, which means the transaction requires you to have something to give. A catalog knife requires a coin and a stamp. And in a coal camp, it required even less than that, because the company store would carry it on the book. That is where the word cheap starts to come apart. Across the Appalachian coal fields, companies paid workers in scrip, private currency, issued by the employer, in tokens or paper notes. Inside the camp, it passed like money. Outside the camp, it was worth whatever somebody would give you for it, and independent traders bought it at a discount. The same store sold a miner the tools he needed underground: picks, shovels, helmets, carbide for the lamp on his head. New men were frequently charged for their transportation into the coal field, their equipment, their first month's rent, and their first week's food, before they had earned a single day's pay. So a knife on that counter might cost a few cents, but it cost a few cents in a kind of money that only worked in one town, on one company's terms, against a debt that in many cases never closed. Anthropologist John Van Willigen at the University of Kentucky and his co-author Susan Eastwood spent years on how a cash crop actually organizes a family. And rather than watch from the road, they worked burley tobacco themselves, from setting the plants through topping, cutting, and stripping, for their book on Kentucky's burley belt. One of the things that comes through in work like that is how completely the calendar of a cash crop dictates the shape of a household's year and the timing of every purchase in it. That is the real texture of cheap in these mountains, not a low number. A low number arriving at the wrong time, in the wrong currency, against a ledger you did not control. The forge did not lose an argument about craftsmanship, it lost an argument about logistics. And the blacksmith's son ordered his knife out of a book. So what happens when a company decides to find out how cheap a working knife can actually get? In 1916, two brothers from Frosinone, a cutlery town in Italy's Molise region, arrived in Providence, Rhode Island. Felix and Michael Mirando had been working at the Empire Knife Company up in Winsted, Connecticut, and they came to Providence because Providence was the center of the American jewelry trade. Their first products were not knives. They were skeletons, the bare working guts of tiny folding knives that hung on pocket watch chains, which jewelers then finished in silver and gold. Within a year, they were turning out more than 1,000 a week. In 1919, a friend from home, Dominic Fasano, came in to manage the business. The company they built, Imperial, would at one point be the largest knife manufacturer in the United States. And it got there by re-engineering the cost of a pocket knife from the inside out. Look at a traditional slip joint, and the bolsters are pinned through the liners. Pins show. That construction is strong, it is serviceable, and it is slow. Now look at the knives that hung on cardboard cards beside the register, in every general store and company commissary in the country. The handle is formed from folded sheet metal shells, crimped over tabs. There are no pins showing on the bolsters, because there are no pins. The price collapsed. So did something else. That knife is very difficult to take apart and put back together, which means the mountain repair economy, the new scales, the reset pin, the second life and the third, runs straight into an object that was not built to be brought back. Be precise about the claim. The construction is visible on the objects themselves. The intent behind it is an inference, not a quote from a boardroom. But the trade is real, and it is the bittersweet center of this whole story. Cheap to buy, expensive to keep. Everything in the first half of this list assumed a thing could be repaired. This knife assumed it would be replaced. One more pattern before the mountains take the story back. Look at a mid-century utility knife of the type the American military bought by the crate, a sheepfoot blade on one end, and a flat locking screwdriver blade with a notch for prying a cap off a bottle on the other. It was made for electricians and signal crews, and after the Second World War, surplus of that kind flooded civilian channels, at prices no domestic manufacturer could touch. The timing matters enormously. In 1935, the Rural Electrification Administration began the long, slow work of running power lines into places the private utilities had written off as unprofitable, which included an enormous share of Appalachia. Through the late 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, a light bulb came on in a house that had never had one. And somebody had to wire it. Mine electricians, line crews, neighbors, doing it themselves, badly, in the evening. So a knife designed for an army became a mountain civilian's everyday knife, for a reason nobody intended. It arrived because the war ended. How widely it was carried is a question the surplus catalogs answer better than the oral histories do. Note the limit. Move on. Now go underground, because there is one man in this story whose pocket knife meant something the others did not. The coal miner rented his house from the company. He bought his tools from the company. He was paid, for decades in many camps, in the company's own money. His children went to a company school, and his family shopped at a company store. His knife was one of the very few things in that life he owned outright. It went down with him every shift. It cut the string on a dinner bucket and the brattice cloth that steered air through the workings. It cut a bootlace, a bandage, a plug of tobacco, a piece of timber wedge. And it came back up in the same pocket, every day, for as long as the man did. The honest boundary here is worth stating. The specific patterns that miners carried are poorly recorded. The economy that put those knives in their pockets is recorded very well indeed, which is its own strange kind of documentation. The cost is on the record. The name of the thing is not. Not every knife on this list was carried for work. Foxfire devoted a chapter to wood carving for the same reason it devoted one to knife making, because whittling in these mountains was not a hobby in the modern sense. It was a social act. Men sat on porches, on store steps, on courthouse lawns, and cut shavings off a stick, not to make anything in particular, but to give the hands something to do while the mouth did the real work. The stick was free, the knife was already in the pocket, and the evening was long. Which is worth saying plainly, because it is easy to miss. Poverty is not only a shortage of money, it is a shortage of ways to spend an evening. And the same small blade that opened feed sacks and dressed a hog also made a child a jointed chain out of a single piece of pine, and a spinning toy out of a notched stick, and a whistle out of green willow in the spring. One pocket, labor on one side, and everything a family had instead of money on the other. Which brings the list to its smallest knife, and its most consequential. The penknife is the least expensive folding configuration there is. 2 small blades, a light frame, a body that vanishes into a vest pocket, an apron pocket, a school bag. The name is a fossil. It comes from a job that has completely disappeared, shaping and reshaping the tip of a quill so a person could keep writing. By the time it reached these mountains, it had a new set of jobs, and they were the constant, invisible, small-scale cutting of running a household, trimming a wick, cutting thread, paring a corn off a foot, opening a seed packet, cutting a child's fingernails. That work was, overwhelmingly, done by women, and the tool it required lived in an apron pocket rather than a trouser pocket, which is a point about labor, not about the pattern. Nobody in these mountains was manufacturing a knife for a gender. And it is here, not at the Barlow, that the first knife story actually belongs. You will hear it said that every Appalachian boy was handed a Barlow on his 8th birthday. It is a beautiful sentence, and there is no body of evidence behind it. What can be supported is broader and, honestly, better. Across rural America, a small, cheap folder was one of the very few pieces of genuinely adult equipment that a child was trusted with early, and being trusted with it was the entire point. The knife was not a gift. The knife was a verdict, a family's decision that this person could now be relied on to do something that could hurt them. Before the last knife, settle the question that has been sitting open since the beginning. Walk into a kitchen in East Tennessee or Eastern Kentucky, ask an older cook to hand you a case knife, and you will be handed the plain, dull knife that sits beside the plate. Not a folding knife, not a brand, a table knife. The standard dictionaries still carry an older sense of the term, a knife kept in a case or a sheath, but across Southern and South Midland speech the phrase drifted somewhere else entirely, toward the everyday eating knife, most likely by way of the sets of table cutlery that were sold boxed, in a case. That drift is well attested in regional speech, and deserves a proper check in the regional dictionaries rather than a shrug. The Dictionary of American Regional English and the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English are where that verification lives. But the practical consequence needs no dictionary. A collector who hears the words case knife in a Kentucky kitchen and pictures a stamped tang has just misread the entire room. The language kept a record the market forgot, which leaves the knife from the opening. It is not a pattern, it is a condition, and it is the truest poor man's knife in this entire list. The physics are simple and completely unforgiving. Every sharpening removes metal. There is no version of maintaining an edge that does not consume the blade. Sharpen a carbon steel pocket knife once a week for 50 years, and it does not stay the shape it left the factory in. It goes hollow through the middle, where the cutting actually happens, and the profile sags inward. The tip either wears away or gets snapped off and reground into a stub. The blade narrows until it will barely clear the liners. Every one of those changes is a decision somebody made, on some particular evening, with a stone. And here is the reversal that ought to change the way you look in a junk box for the rest of your life. The market grades condition against the factory. Mint is the top of the scale, and everything below it is a subtraction, which means the scale runs backwards. It is not measuring how well a knife served. It is measuring how successfully it was avoided. A knife in mint condition is a knife that failed to be needed. That crescent of steel in the drawer is the opposite. It records that somebody needed it. It records roughly how long, and it records that they either could not replace it or would not. Where is not what happened to the knife. Where is the evidence? 15 knives. A file that would not quit. A saw blade that outlived its mill, a kitchen blade sent back out to work, a handle cut by hand, a knife that came down through a family, a Barlow worth 12.5 cents, a jackknife that rationed its own steel, a stockman built around chores, a pruner that pulled instead of pushed, a shell-handled knife off a cardboard card, a soldier's utility knife wired into the hollows, a miner's one piece of private property, a whittler's evening, a penknife in an apron pocket, and a blade sharpened almost entirely out of existence. None of them were made for a display case. All of them ended up telling the truth anyway. Somewhere in these mountains that last knife is still in its drawer, and the person who wore it down is almost certainly gone. I have held an object like that, lighter in the hand than it was ever meant to be, most of itself gone into work that nobody wrote down, and understood that I was not holding a ruined thing at all, but a record. A knife in mint condition tells us what a factory was capable of making. A knife worn to almost nothing tells us what a family could not do without. If that is the kind of truth you came here for, the object rather than the legend, the evidence rather than the story, we would prefer, then you already belong here.